If you want real-time updates on Trump's policies, America's economy, and the latest political news, subscribe to the Trump Briefing Room and turn on notifications. We bring you straight facts, daily updates, and
Mr.
powerful
President, could we have
analysis.
order in the
No
chamber,
bias,
please?
just the truth.
order.
Subscribe now and stay informed.
Welfare fraud, taxpayer money. Now, I want to make it clear that I love Minnesota. I love Minnesota. But I do not like people, whether they live in Minnesota or elsewhere, who steal money from the poor. There ought to be a special place in hell for them. By now, unless you are still living in your parents' basement playing video games, you know that there has been massive welfare fraud in Minnesota. It's staggering, it's stunning, it's astounding. It may rise to the level of $9 billion of taxpayer money meant for the poor. $9 billion. Now, it's an uncomfortable truth that at this juncture, most of that fraud appears to be centered in the community of Minneapolis among people of Somali ancestry. Some have said and suggested that it's racist to say that. Facts are not racist. What I just said is just a fact. So far, there have been 90 people charged, most of whom are of Somali descent. That's just a fact. There are over 100,000 people of Somali ancestry in Minnesota, most of them in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And the vast majority of them vote in a bloc, as is their right. And a vast majority of them vote in a bloc for Democratic candidates, as is their right. Some will say Kennedy's being a racist for pointing that out. Let me say it again. Facts are not racist. They're facts. It's already come out at some of the trials. And not all of the folks being charged are of Somali ancestry. I want to make that very clear. But most of them are. Again, just a fact. I apologize for my voice. Now, let me explain what this thievery, this industrial scale fraud was all about. It was centered around Medicaid. And as you know, Mr. President, Medicaid is a federal program administered by the states. We put up most of the money to provide health coverage for poor people, for pregnant women, for children, and for disabled people. Now, President Obama, through Obamacare, extended Medicaid to some folks in the middle class, but still the main purpose of Medicaid is to help poor folks and disabled folks. Because in America, we help our friends. You know, I was looking at a number the other day. In the last 50 years, the American economy has grown 142% in the last 50 years. The American economy has grown 142% in the last 50 years. Pretty extraordinary number. Welfare spending in America has grown 765%. So I get a little upset when some people say, well, the American people are selfish. We spend over $1 trillion a year helping our neighbors who are less fortunate than us, mostly the poor. In our country, I've said this before, if you're hungry, we'll feed you. If you're homeless, we'll house you. If you're too poor to be sick, we'll pay for your doctor. Other countries let their fellow citizens die in a ditch. We don't do that in America. The American people have stepped up to the plate. So when people steal this money, this $1 trillion plus a year that we spend helping our neighbors, when people steal that money, it offends me. When they steal from the poor and they steal from the American taxpayer. It offends me equally. And the folks in Minnesota and elsewhere who stole this money, who took a giant Great Dane whiz down the leg of every taxpayer and poor person in America, every one of them ought to go to jail. There were it looks like so far there are 4 programs. Medicaid, and let me just say, the federal government puts up most of the money for Medicaid, not all of it. In some cases, the federal government puts up as little as 50%. In some cases, 90% of the money being spent on Medicaid comes from federal taxpayers. We design the rules at the federal level. We put up most of the money, but the states are supposed to implement the program, and they're supposed to combat fraud, and many of them don't. The GAO says that of that $1 trillion I talked about that the American people spend on welfare, as much as $250 billion, maybe more, 250 billion or more, is stolen. And it's got to stop. And I'm going to talk about a solution in a moment. But let me tell you what was happening in Minnesota. One of the things Medicaid does, along with the food stamp program, is to feed people, particularly children. So what these thieves in Minnesota were doing, they were setting up these fictitious corporations and applying to Governor Tim Walz's Medicaid office for money to distribute to the poor. And Governor Tim Walz's welfare office would give them hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, the thieves running these fictitious corporations sucked it up like a Hoover Deluxe. And then these fictitious corporations would go to restaurants in the community, many of them in the Somali community, and say, here's the deal. I want you to fill out a report saying you fed all these poor people. Of course, you're not feeding anybody. Just lie. And give me the report. And I'll give you a percentage of the money that I'm stealing from the American taxpayer and the people of Minnesota. And that's what they did. But they didn't just limit it to food. It was industrial scale fraud. Next, they moved to health care. They formed, some formed fictitious corporations, companies, saying we're going to deliver I said health care, I meant child care to poor people, homeless people. And so the fictitious company run by these thieves would go to Governor Walz's agencies and say, give us a bunch of money, we're going to house homeless people. And Governor Walz would give them the money, and the thieves sucked it up like a Hoover Deluxe. And then they went to a bunch of other of folks in the community and said, henceforth, you're in the housing business, and you need to fill out a report. It's a lie. Fill out a report saying you're providing housing for a bunch of people. Of course, they weren't. And then we, the thieves who got the money from Governor Walz, will kick you back a little bit of the money. Did they stop there? No. Then they moved into, I just described housing, they moved into child care. Under Medicaid, you can use money to provide child care. So the thieves formed a bunch of new fictitious companies and went to Governor Walz and his agencies and said, give us a bunch of welfare money, Medicaid money, give folks who are poor child care. And then the thieves running the fictitious company went to families, many of them in the Somali community, and said, do you have a child who's autistic? If so, we want to sign them up. But if some of the families said, no, we don't have a child who's autistic, the thieves said, don't worry about it. Lie. Tell us you have a child who's autistic. And whether your child is autistic or not, we're not going to provide any services for your children, but we will kick you back some of the money. It's disgusting. So it was in child care, housing, autism, food. $9 billion and climbing. Now, Governor Walz, in fact, I probably shouldn't repeat this, but I read something on the internet the other day. Somebody made an observation. They said, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because there's some fine child care services in Minnesota as there are elsewhere, but the person on social media asked a question: How do you know if you've discovered one of these fictitious child care services? Well, you go there and no one's inside, but the owner pulls up in a Lamborghini. And that's what happened. The people who were stealing the money directly from Governor Walz and then giving it to the folks that were helping them, the fictitious restaurants, or the restaurants creating fictitious lists of people they fed, autistic children they were helping who weren't autistic. They took the money too, and all of them had a big old party. They bought cars, they bought jewelry, they took expensive vacations, they sent money back to Somalia. There is an investigation going on right now, I'm not saying it's true, that some of the money might have gone to terrorist organizations in Somalia. American taxpayer money that these people were taking out of the mouths of poor people. Now, Governor Walz says, I knew nothing about this, man. It's news to me. And he said, in fact, I'm taking some bold steps. He said, at first, I'm not going to run for a third term. I guess he needs more time. Hope he uses the time to prepare his defense, because he's got a lot to defend here. He knew what was going on. In fact, one of the lawyers representing one of the thieves in this case said many of the people, this was their excuse, said many of the people involved in the stealing thought that the state was okay with it. That's what he said. Here's his quote: no one was doing anything about the red flags. Red flags were everywhere. Nobody in state government, he said, was doing anything about the red flags. It was like someone was stealing money from the cookie jar and they kept refilling it. The state knew. And at one point, Governor Walz and some of his agencies said, whoa, maybe we ought to put a stop to this. And they backed off. They said, no more money for a while. Well, fresh hell broke loose. You know what happened? The largest, most powerful, fictitious company, run mostly by people of Somali ancestry, sent an email to the Minnesota state government And they said that the state agency that was failing to promptly approve new applications and give us new money from, quote, minority-owned businesses, close quote, was going to result in a lawsuit featuring accusations of racism that would be sprawled across the news. If you don't give us our money, we're going to call you racist. They did it. It's all come out in evidence at trial. In fact, a lady by the name of Kaysa Megan, she's one of the good guys. She is a Somali American who used to work as a fraud investigator in the Attorney General's office, who, by the way, was just as involved as Governor Walz in turning a blind eye to all this. She says, and she said it in the newspaper, she said that elected officials, and particularly those who are part of the state's Democratic-led administration, were reluctant to take more assertive action in response to the allegations. Why? Here's her quote. There is a perception that forcefully tackling this issue might cause political backlash from the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats. And she is among the few among many prominent figures in the Somali community who is speaking out against the fraud. In fact, at one point, a bunch of state employees, I don't remember how many, but they posted a letter publicly on social media saying Governor Walz knew about, and the Attorney General knew about this all the time. And we told them. We warned them early on. And you know what they did? They just stood there sucking on their teeth. They did nothing. And so you know what the state employees did? They went to the U.S. Attorney. They went to the U.S. Attorney. And the U.S. Attorney jumped all over this and said this is obvious fraud. And that's how all this got started. Now, what do we do about it? Well, first, I don't think that the only place this is happening is Minnesota. And certainly there are people involved in welfare fraud besides the few Somali Americans in Minnesota. And I mentioned the Somali Americans because it's just a fact. It's a fact in the trial of these disputes, the politics of it and everything else in the litigation. I think it's happening in various degrees all over America. Let me say it again. We're spending $1 trillion a year of American taxpayer money to help poor people, provide welfare, and GAO estimates that about at least $250 billion is being stolen every year. We took some baby steps in the One Big Beautiful Bill, as you know, Mr. President. We tightened up eligibility requirements. We're requiring states to check twice a year to make sure people don't lie when they sign up for Medicaid or for food stamps or for housing assistance. We've implemented a work requirement, but we need to do more. We need to do more, and that's why we need to do another reconciliation bill. Now, I hope I'm wrong when I say this. I hope I'm wrong. I invite my Democratic colleagues in the Senate. I love them all to come forward and help us, but I just know politics, and you do too, Mr. President. A lot of them are going to be reluctant. But we don't need their assistance. We can pass a welfare security bill with all Democratic votes. If I could do it on my own, I would introduce the bill tomorrow. I would go and look at every single state and every single country and look for the best practices on presenting.
Senator Kennedy, Louisiana, accuses Minnesota's government of enabling massive welfare fraud, alleging Governor Tim Walz and state officials ignored warning signs while $9 billion in Medicaid funds meant for the poor were stolen through fictitious companies. Senator John Kennedy, Republican, Louisiana, demanding welfare reform through reconciliation bill. Governor Tim Walz, Minnesota, accused of knowing about fraud and doing nothing. Somali American community in Minneapolis, most of 90 charged defendants. Kennedy emphasizes this as just a fact, not racism. Kwesa Megan, Somali American former fraud investigator, whistleblower supporting Kennedy's claims. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Kennedy's target audience, being asked to bring reconciliation bill to the floor. Kennedy describes industrial-scale theft across 4 Medicaid programs. Food assistance. Fictitious corporations received state funds, paid restaurants to file false reports claiming they fed poor people. Housing. Fake companies obtained money for homeless services, kicked back portions to individuals filing fraudulent reports. Childcare. Families told to falsely claim autistic children and received kickbacks while no services provided. Autism services. Money distributed for non-existent care. Warning signs ignored. State employees allegedly reported fraud early. Officials did nothing until they contacted federal prosecutors. Democratic voting bloc concern. Kennedy cites investigator Megan's claim that officials feared political backlash from the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats. Racism allegations as leverage. Evidence shows one major company threatened lawsuit with accusations of racism sprawled across the news when state delayed approvals. Walz's response. Governor announced he won't seek a third term, claims ignorance of fraud. Immediate action. Second reconciliation bill focused on welfare reform. Proposed solutions. Adopt best practices from all states and countries. Cross-check welfare applicants against tax records. Require biannual eligibility verification, partially achieved in recent bill. Implement work requirements. Scale of problem. GAO estimates $250 billion of $1 trillion annual welfare spending is stolen nationwide. Moral imperative. There ought to be a special place in hell for those who steal from the poor. Economy grew 142% in 50 years. Welfare spending grew 765%. Systemic failure. Not just Minnesota. Kennedy believes fraud is widespread nationally. Political obstacles. Expects Democrats won't help. Wants Republican-only reconciliation bill. Kennedy pleads with Senator Thune to bring welfare reform reconciliation bill to the Senate floor, arguing Republicans can pass it without Democratic support. Frames it as moral urgency. Let's go get the pigs out of the creek.